Tonight on Movie Cat, we're going to spill the tea about A Room with a View. A Room with a View was initially a 1908 novel by English author E.M. Forster. 3/4 of a century later, it was adapted into a screenplay by Ruth Jabvala. The film was directed by James Ivory and produced by Ismail Merchant. It stars Helena Bonham Carter, Maggie Smith, Julian Sands, and Daniel Day-Lewis, among others. Tonight I'm watching the region-free 2007 Blu-ray release from BBC America, but I first saw this film in the theater in the mid-80s. It still holds up today as possibly the most charming movie I've ever seen. It is also arguably the most romantic film in cinema history. A Room with a View gets a rare AA grade. It gets an A for general audiences watching this film for the first time. It also gets an A for the intended audience of Brits and Anglophiles. I'll talk more about this in a little bit. A Room with a View is the cinematic equivalent of a spa day. It's so pleasant to watch that you leave the theater smelling better. This is quite different than the usual movie-going experience, even for other romances. Usually filmmakers take their audience on a roller coaster ride of extreme emotions in order to squeeze every last bit of feeling out of them. I think filmmakers focus on negative feelings because they are easier to conjure. This was true in the 1980s, and it's true today. Clearly, James Ivory went another direction. E.M. Forster's novel is a pleasing tale of an Edwardian English ingenue who has set the simple business of choosing between two suitors. This framework allows for Forster to comment on English culture at the turn of the century, critiquing class, wealth, education, personal freedom, and identity, along with some women's issues thrown in for good measure. Forster was writing at the height of the period he was appraising. When James Ivory started work on his film Adaptation, he was looking back at an era 77 years in the past. Ivory makes the choice to depart from the book in some ways because the issues of the novel were no longer relevant, or at least less so. What Forster was living through in Edwardian England, by 1980 standards, was viewed as merely quaint. And the film demonstrates this. Ivory transforms Forster's criticisms into charm, and he does it beautifully. For James Ivory, A Room with a View is about charm, but above all else, romance. Depicting romance is a difficult pursuit, and environment can be tricky. There are the traps of cliché and stupidity to look out for, among others, but Ivory navigates the story by banishing all forms of cynicism and returning to what love is at its core, innocence. A Room with a View begins by setting a tone of elegance with ornately decorated titles over a white background. Similar titles also divide the film up into sections or chapters. Ivory has chosen to foreground various arias and other sumptuously romantic music. This, paired with the almost too idyllic settings, pushes the most romantic sentiment possible. The film is almost too much, but somehow the equation balances. The film follows young Miss Lucy Honeychurch along with her various English friends and family from a holiday in Florence and then back to her small country town in England. The movie begins with her arrival at a pensione along with her older cousin and chaperone, Charlotte. They are disappointed that their room does not have a view of the Arno River. Later they go down for dinner and meet several of the pensione's other English visitors, including Mr. Emerson and his son George. Overhearing their complaints about their view, Mr. Emerson offers to swap rooms with them, and thus begins the acquaintance of Lucy and George. This simple dinner scene introduces several of the characters, and along with each comes Forster's subtle criticisms of Edwardian life. The next day, Lucy goes out to do some sightseeing. She runs into the Emersons at a cathedral where she chats with Mr. Emerson. He explains his son's depression and fears that his liberal upbringing may be the cause, essentially free from the usual repressions of English culture. As Lucy is heading back to the pensione, she stops to buy some postcards. There she witnesses a fight between two Italians. One stabs the other. Lucy is so shocked at the violence that she faints, but as she falls, she is caught by George. He carries her to the square steps for her to recover. They then head back together. George expresses his belief that he and Lucy have been brought together through fate, and that their meeting is somehow of great importance. Sometime later, the group of English tourists heads out into the Italian countryside. The ladies picnic on one hillside and the gentlemen on the other. Because the ladies wish to discuss more grown-up gossip, Lucy is sent to join the gentlemen. She eventually finds George as he enjoys the view in an isolated meadow. When he sees her, he goes to her and kisses her passionately. Almost immediately, they are interrupted by Charlotte. This brief romantic exchange becomes the secret motivating factor for Lucy, George, and Charlotte for the rest of the film. The story picks up back in England in Summer Street, where Lucy has just become engaged to Cecil Vyse, a snobby, upper-class Londoner. The story skips over Cecil and Lucy's courtship, but the film does show a series of scenes after their engagement, depicting Cecil's pride in capturing the beautiful Lucy and showing her off to his friends. Cecil is almost the complete opposite to George Emerson in every way. In a strange coincidence, Cecil meets George and Mr. Emerson in London and tells them of a house that they can rent in Summer Street, where Lucy and the Honeychurches live. So the father and son move there and become the neighbors to Lucy and company. George, of course, sees the coincidence as fate. As George learns of Lucy's engagement and more about the type of person Cecil is, he attempts once more to woo Lucy. She resolutely rejects him and he gives up. But he has made her realize that marrying Cecil would be a mistake, and she calls off her engagement. There is some comedy and juggling of hearts in the third act, but finally Lucy admits to herself and to everyone that she is in love with George. James Ivory took a risk when making A Room with a View. While much of the social commentary Forster wrote about in his novel still exists in the film, Ivory chooses to downplay it. Instead, he foregrounds the innocence of romance, indulges in the beauty of the settings, and idealizes the charm of a long-gone era. What were current concerns in Edwardian time, Ivory diminishes, and so do we as the audience, in much the same way as adults regard the affairs of adolescence. I don't think Ivory did this as a reaction to Forster's concerns, as if to say that class and women's issues were not and are not important. Rather, I think Ivory saw that he could navigate these issues without spoiling the romance if he highlighted Forster's solutions to Edwardian societal problems, however naive, instead of ruminating on their deleterious effects. Forster felt that personal freedom should be increased, and that societal pressure that constrained class, education, and wealth should be alleviated. In the film, we see many instances of the characters engaging in freedoms, and almost no scenes where Edwardian restrictions are so apparent that they affect the plot. George declaring the eternal yes while climbing a tree, or Eleanor and Charlotte drifting through the streets of Florence unescorted. I think Forster also predicted a future where these ideas would come to pass, as he was witnessing the very beginning of the women's movement. While Forster was looking to the future, Ivory was looking to the past. His film could have been a work about oppression, but instead is a film about prosperity. And A Room with a View is a refreshing and positive love story, despite the cultural limitations of the time. Ivory achieves this by modulating the antagonistic elements of the story so as to render Edwardian oppressions charmingly antique. For example, the restrictive dress that Lucy wears during her scene with George in the Italian hillside meadow does not prevent her from going to George, but creates a kind of awkwardness in her gait, illustrating her emerging uneasy attraction to him. Or the scene in which Miss Bartlett insists on herself paying for her cab from the train station. This comment about women's independence, even in that small way, Ivory turns into a small comedic bit, akin to Abbott and Costello. Of course, the chief antagonist in the film is Edwardian English culture itself. This is manifested in two characters, Cecil Vyse and Charlotte Bartlett. These two characters personify the cliched stuffiness of the English disposition, Cecil with his foppish pomposity, and Charlotte's irksome fixation on properness. Both of these characters Ivory deflates by relegating them to the comedy bin, even if that comedy is subtle. There's something endearingly silly about Cecil and Charlotte. Why Cecil and Charlotte are motivated by English culture becomes apparent right away that it is the Italian culture that at first infects and then motivates Lucy and George and the rest of the film as well. The Italians stand in stark contrast to the English in the film. The Italian culture is depicted as one of freedom and passion, a country of the heart. Forster illustrates the English longing for Italian ways in the very title of his novel. The pensione that Lucy and Charlotte stay at is a bubble of English primness, and the view that they want is the freedoms promised by Italian culture. This contrast Ivory literally depicts as the window in Lucy's room. James Ivory has said that he took on the making of A Room with a View because he wanted to make a film in Italy. Ivory seems to be motivated by the very same thing that motivates his characters. Not just the beauty of Italy, but beauty overall. Ivory's film is one that gets straight to the core of love and romance and beauty, and that is Innocence. Why this film is so successful as a romance is that Ivory sticks to the theme of innocence and avoids cynicism and hidden meanings and negative subtexts. Ivory delivers the story plainly and directly. This has the refreshing effect of creating trust among the audience. As you're watching the film, it is easy to believe the meanings that Ivory presents, because there is no subtext. In this way, it is perhaps a simple-minded film. After watching A Room with a View, it's pretty easy to understand why it gets an A for regular audiences and an A for its intended audience. A Room with a View is such a pleasure to watch, I think mostly because it eschews the standard methods of provoking emotion in an audience. Ivory's goal is to give us pure beauty and romance, and he serves it up to us directly without making us think that he has some ulterior motive that may lead us into a trap. Ivory isn't trying to denigrate us or shame us. The film is a simple statement about what is beautiful in the world. The photography in A Room with a View doesn't seem very interesting at first. In fact, it seems quite plain. There aren't any dramatic camera effects or in-your-face filters. Ivory, in traditional form, removes the camera from the experience. We don't even notice it. The key element when it comes to Tony Pierce Roberts' cinematography is the subject and the framing of that subject. The settings are beautiful, the people are beautiful, the light is beautiful, the result is beautiful images. What most people notice right away when the film starts is the music. Ivory foregrounds the music above sound effects and ambience. The music is often louder than the dialogue, although it never competes with the actors. Most memorably, Ivory uses Italian arias, and in particular Puccini's O mio bambino caro. The music is as sumptuous as the visuals. The music is also the first thing that tells us that the filmmakers may have taken it too far. But when we begin to meet the subdued English characters, we start to notice a fascinating complement. The music, along with the metaphorical view, is a reflection of the characters' personal desires, namely Lucy and George. In this way, the music is not simply non-diegetic window dressing, it plays an active role. The A-list cast is the bedrock of this film. No amount of settings and arias and costumes could replace this cast. Working from Ruth Jabwala's outstanding screenplay, the cast is mostly seasoned professionals, except for newcomer Helena Bonham Carter. Her portrayal of the sweet but willful Lucy is dead on. It's such an iconic performance that it's basically impossible to imagine a different interpretation of the character. George is my favorite Julian Sands performance. Sands does have a reputation as being somewhat of a gamble in casting, but I love him as George. Of course he is the most handsome person of the film, but Sands is also able to bring the solemn doubtfulness of the character without falling into melodrama. Maggie Smith as Charlotte is simultaneously funny and charming and irritating and infuriating and then back again. It is definitely a strange trick to annoy and keep an audience. And then Daniel Day-Lewis. He's not really like that in real life, although you wouldn't know it. His Cecil Vyse is an amazingly well-crafted performance. Just the precision in his movements and gestures are impressive, let alone the way that he articulates his lines with just the right inflection to show us who Cecil is. Of course, the rest of the cast is amazing as well. From Denholm Elliott to Simon Callow, I could go on and on. I think why Ivory was so successful in bringing A Room with a View to the screen is that he was able to maintain the theme of innocence by working with his team so as not to diverge from the aim. In thinking back about the film, it really does seem like an effort by all those involved. From crew and cast, the result is remarkably refreshing and uplifting, which I suppose is the whole point. Hey movie cats, I'm just a puppet, but there are real cats out there that need your help, really. Please take some time to locate the cat shelter that is nearest to you and make a donation. And if you're in need of some love, as we all are, you can adopt a cat from that shelter and improve your life, as well as the lives of our feline friends. This week, Movie Cat is highlighting this shelter. Thanks so much for your help.